Join me in a short prayer prior to that. Living God, help us to hear your word that we may truly understand. That understanding we may believe, and in believing that we may follow your way in faithfulness, seeking your honor and glory in all that we do. Amen. Woe to Chorazin. Woe to you, Bethsaida. For if Tyre and Sidon, if they had repented long ago, sitting in sackcloth and ashes, indeed at the judgment it will be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon than for you. And you, Capernaum, you will be exalted to heaven. Will you be exalted to heaven? No, you will be brought down to the Hades. Whoever listens to you listens to me, and whoever rejects you rejects me, and whoever rejects me rejects the one who sent me. That's our scripture reading. Praise be to God.
Thanks be to God.
The other month when I was selecting text for Lent, I picked this one out. On later observation, it was probably not the best text to be saying woe to cities. The Sunday after we hosted the city of Durango's presentation about this neighborhood. Sometimes scheduling is not the best done. Although there is part of me occasionally after dealing with a little bit of city bureaucracy with kind of the buzzwords that maybe a little fire and brimstone is in order, but that's just kind of personal preference. But today, as Jesus continues to set his face towards Jerusalem, as he approaches the city of David, as he approaches the Temple Mount, which is the center of sacred life in which the whole city revolves around, we have this odd pronouncement about cities. Jesus is kind of throwing some shade at Bethesda, Capernaum, Chorazin, and which Jesus and his disciples are very familiar with. In fact, they have had sometimes just some mixed results. There have been some miracles. Some of the miracles are also not the most outstanding. I'm sure Peter appreciated when his mom was cured of the flu so they could serve tea and cookies to Jesus and his disciples unannounced. There are some differences in miracles. And also, some of these are just unfamiliar. This week, I looked at Fred Craddock's commentary, and he points out that Chorazin is never mentioned but here in the Bible. Perhaps the town is just kind of the butt of jokes as Cleveland, Ohio was in the 1900s. If you ever said if you're going somewhere interesting, you would always ask somebody if they're going to Cleveland, and they would just look at you funny. But, there's some things that just stay the same, I guess. We also have kind of in this text this age-old divide between city and countryside. And this is still with us a little bit today. If we look at an electoral map, we'll see the cities are one color, the county and suburban areas are another. We are familiar with this in culture as well in the 20th century as we finally crossed that line where more people lived in cities rather than the countryside. It was a time for one of the great works of art, which was the Country Mouse and City Mouse series. Perhaps you read that series to your children in books. Maybe some of you are more familiar with the Walt Disney cartoons with the little mice, meeting for the first time and teaching each other about the ways that they live. I also kind of like this in popular culture as well. I remember the old Anthony Bourdain kind of food shows. I think there were several incarnations of that where there was no reservations, whether he was on CNN. But I always liked it because you had kind of this 6'3", 6'4" New York chef who worked at the fancy, French restaurants where his parents were kind of the journalist and kind of from the, kind of the fancy French restaurants. And they would always put him in awkward situations because occasionally when you were exploring food, you would have to go out to the country. One of the episodes of his I like the most were when he went to the Ozarks of Missouri. Having served a church in the northern part of the Ozarks, I kind of felt at home seeing him for the first time there. It'd be interesting because Anthony would be sitting out there and he'd be outside of kind of a duck blind. He'd be wearing kind of the tight jeans, the pea coat, and kind of the bright New York sneakers that were popular during that time. And it was always interesting because they'd be out there hunting ducks and he'd be clearly holding something that would be more appropriate for a rabbit. I think it was more of a prop. He would just be kind of sitting there. And we also knew kind of the gun was unloaded for everybody else's safety as well. But I think he kind of knew this joke. He'd become kind of part of it for so long. In fact, he would look into the camera and say, "It is time for the ritual humiliation." He would say, "We go hunting," and of course they never shoot anything. But for whatever reason, actually, at that time, some of the local guys actually shot a few ducks while they were there. And it was actually kind of fun because, Anthony was surprised. He was kind of wondering. And then when the kind of local people, and he was asking, he was like, "Well, how are you going to cook this duck? I'm going to learn." And he's just like, "Well, we like being outside and shooting. We really, most of the time, we give the duck away. We really don't like it." And Anthony was like, No. I'm going to teach you how to cook duck." And so he does. And so the New York, chef teaches these country boys how to cook duck properly in the French style. And you see kind of these guys with the goatees and still wearing their camo, eating and enjoying the meal. In fact, you could see later on, they kind of called everybody together, and as we kind of do out in the Ozarks of Missouri, if you have too many people to fit in the dining room, well, you bring them into the garage, and you set up tables, and you have the finest Dixie china. And it was funny because he was sitting there, and they were serving squirrel pot pie, some of Anthony's wild duck, and the younger, more kind of blunt person answered the question that our New York chef, Anthony Bourdain, asked, and he said, "How country is it out here?" And like I said, the younger, more blunt member of the dinner party answers and says, "That dish over there is raccoon." You don't get more country than that. Now, this country and city divide is also present in the Gospels. When we look at the Gospel of Matthew, we will see stories, and they'll seem a little bit more country. If we look at the stories in Luke, we'll see that they're really written for a more kind of city audience. They have two different audiences, even though they are reaching the greater audience of people who need to know about Jesus. And if we look at some of the stories, we can see that really develop. There's a great story about these friends who want to get people to Jesus, to know Jesus, to heal their friend who has been hurt, who is lame. And in the Gospel of Matthew, it's interesting because you can kind of picture them coming up a country road, because when they are tearing the roof apart, they were pulling apart thatch, which is what country people roof their houses with. In the Gospel of Luke, when they see the friends tearing apart that roof to lower the man down for Jesus to heal, they're pulling off clay tiles, which serve as the roofing in cities. And so both ways, the Gospels know they can reach their audience. And sometimes we kind of see this translated into Christian theology as well. In fact, the real first piece of Christian theology is called the Didache. And it was written very early, and you can kind of tell it's really a manual of the Christian life that is written for people who are living out in the country. Most of early Christianity took place in the city. We have a lot of the churches, the house churches used to meet there, and so they were writing down all kind of this manual, and they're sending out in the country. So how to baptize people, how we should live, how we should give, how we are to wake up and pray in the morning. These are all kind of ways and really defining how the theology of the church works. It's also interesting is there are different cities associated with different apostles. So James, the brother of Jesus, hang out in Jerusalem. We know that Peter is associated with Rome. We know Mark is associated with Alexandria. And Paul is really just all over the place in Greece and Turkey, many different cities. But even though we have many different cities, many different styles, and even the countryside, because we know the deacons, the apostles would preach in the country as well, there is also a little bit of a divide as well. And sometimes that would show up in our theology. In North Africa, where Christians were kind of debating in a time about kind of philosophy, there was a family, a church father called Tertullian, who famously said, "What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem?" And he was kind of in the country in North Africa, and he was poking fun at kind of the highfalutin concerns of the learned who were debating whether Greek philosophy was going to be central. And he was kind of talking and saying, well, you Christian theologians, that's great, but our sisters in the faith are being persecuted and publicly executed in the arena. We need to get at the crux of the gospel. We need to talk about Jesus. Likewise, after the fall of Rome, the great theologian Augustine of Hippo, also in North Africa, but he was more in the city parts of North Africa, and he was no stranger. In fact, he famously had a very strong preaching voice, and so he would kind of tailor his sermons because he knew that people could hear him all the way outside if the doors were open. And he would kind of tailor his sermon to those who were inside and those who were outside as well. And when in his famous piece, one of his famous pieces of theology is called The City of God. And this was written in response to the city of Rome being sacked, where Roman culture was in decline. Of over 600 years where the city of Rome had stood undefeated, they were now seeing that the world was changing, and that Augustine was preaching and saying you need to look to the city of God because the city of God is indestructible. Empires rise and fall, but put your faith in Christ. In America, we have this kind of tradition of theology as well. The Puritans who settled in the Massachusetts Bay Colony were kind of arriving from a more kind of city background and changing to a more of a country background. But one of the things they all agreed on is that they were famously going to be on a city on a hill, that all of society would look at them, that they would be an example of how to live your life, how to live faithfully the Christian life. And to be fair, that first generation did pretty well. They lived in peace with their neighbors. They were able to build up their community, build up the faith here in America. But the second and third generation, not so much. They engaged in war, and they were a little bit too interested in witchcraft in places like Salem, Massachusetts. But this legacy has arrived for us as well, as we sit there and we wonder what could have been. Also, echoes of that in the 20th century life as we were looking to our country, looking to our faith as something that others could look to. In fact, Harvey Cox, a theologian in the mid-20th century, described the secular city. He was pointing out how in the past urban areas were dominated by cathedrals, whether that was Notre Dame in Paris, whether it was the Vatican in Rome, whether it was St. Paul's or Westminster Abbey in London, that he had said that many of the people, many Christians had seceded the sacred ground to the secular. And this kind of had two responses in his time. Here in Arizona and in Colorado, Vine Deloria Jr. said we need to focus more on kind of the native theology. We need to understand the sacredness of space and time. In his book, God is Red, he lifted the concepts once again of finding the sacred in our spaces, and especially how we consider space to be sacred. In fact, he talked about the holy mountains of Hesperus just in our backyard and all the way down at Blanca over there by Alamosa, and talked about how Christians need to regain the idea of sacred space. course, the other option was they took it a little bit more liberal, so a little bit more literal. And after the 1970s, they said, well, if everybody's agreeing that cities are secular, maybe we need to go back in. And so in the 1990s and the 2000s, kind of our evangelical friends and also some Presbyterians of a more evangelical nature would move into the city centers. And so you started seeing churches of the resurrection, churches of the Redeemer. You saw people who have Reformed or Presbyterian theology like Tim Keller starting churches in New York City. It became so popular that even when I was in seminary in Little Richmond, Virginia, which is one of the larger cities in the state of Virginia, it was fun to see my classmate Percy was heavily influenced by this national trend. And so he drove a little mini yellow school bus, and on the side of it, it said chat. And he became an evangelist for the program that he ran called Church Hill Activities and Tutoring, Chat. And so he would go and he'd pick up school-age kids from kind of the inner city part of Richmond, in the old segregated part of town. And he would sit there and they would sit there and have activities. They'd have tutoring. They finally expanded a little bit more year by year. And finally, you couldn't fit all the kids in one of those one little mini school buses. And it had kind of thousands of kids doing it. But the predominantly people who were volunteers and serving, it was interesting because they were kind of evangelical Asian and white kids who had grown up in the suburbs who were now living and working in the African American part of town. And rather than gentrifying it, they lived missionally, intentionally, and they expanded the programs and even planted another campus of Third Presbyterian Church. And so it was kind of fun to see kind of these people living and moving into the city. But if we move back to our text, it is good to be reminded about kind of the idea of perception. Jesus is looking and seeing these kind of cities that he is known all his life, Bethesda, Capernaum, and he is comparing them to cities of Tyre and Sidon, just out kind of these foreign cities outside of where him and his community usually go. And we were reminded also that our perception matters. I've been listening to a David Brooks, who is an author, and in his recent books, he is talking about many things. Part of it is how he has converted to Christianity, but he lifts up this part of perception. In his new book, he points that our situation shapes what we see. So in Jesus' time, if people are looking at Galilee and those cities, and if they saw a prophet like Jesus, they would think this is pretty regular. In their context, seeing a prophet or a traveling rabbi is pretty normal. If we go back just a few months ago when we were talking about the city of Nineveh and Jonah the prophet, people in Nineveh seeing Jonah coming out of the desert, smelling like a fish. They say this is peculiar, and they might listen to what he says. If you're in the middle of the desert and you smell like fish, that is going to be something that you want to know about. Instead, the prophet Jonah gives them a message, and they hear it, and they all repent, even their little animals, if we remember that story. So Bethesda and Capernaum, when they see this rabbi Jesus, they are seeing something very different than perhaps the towns of Tyre and Sidon, which will see Jesus differently. And also we see Jesus comparing those two differently. Now, sometimes our experiences influences us. Just a couple of weeks ago during one of our pop hikes, I guess it was January, perception mattered a lot. I wimped out in January because I didn't think I brought the proper warm weather clothes. Meanwhile, some of you more experienced hikers realize this is the warmest January in 20 years, and you were wondering why we weren't going up there wearing shorts at the time. And I think that hike was up in Mullis Pass, and you all had a good time, and I'm sitting here wondering why I didn't go. And it's kind of the same with Jesus as rabbi, as this prophet, as this miracle worker. when he notices that his neighbor, his people are not responding, he is getting a little bit perturbed. This is kind of a human experience. This is something that we might have an experience with ourselves. I remember when I was in my college days, we would go to the chapel and there might be a service or something. And I remember a bunch of my fraternity brothers were all together and I was kind of getting mad at Chris Luther because he was wearing his hat in a church. And having grown up in the Southern church, you do not wear your hat at church. And finally, Chris was on me and saying, well, why aren't you, getting on the case of like Sean Wasserman or Mike Epstein? Why aren't you getting on, kind of all these other people's case? And I was like, well, they're Jewish. They're supposed to wear hats in church. It's like, we're Presbyterian. We're supposed to do things differently, which was a kind of a prelude to an invitation because Chris Luther invited me to his house for Easter, and I discovered that there are definitely different ways that Presbyterians in the Midwest and Presbyterians on the East Coast celebrate Easter. And if you want to ask about that, feel free, but it was very interesting how they did that. But how does this text impact us today? I think it helps with expectations. We might say or do something that is mundane in our eyes, but it can have a serious impact on non-believers. What we take for granted is just kind of a throwaway line somebody might take as profound, or maybe somebody sees the world in a different way. Likewise, kind of in this era of virtue signaling, of social media, shaming, of groupthink, we notice some of the disingenuous behavior of those who look down on Christians from kind of their pedestal. And for some of those people, it has been rough in the last couple of months. Kind of this fascination with the release of the Epstein files. It's been interesting to people who've been calling out Christians, have been kind of smug in their own perceived virtue, are getting caught up in this new kind of era of where people are looking and seeing what's happening. And it's kind of interesting to see how people are changing, about how our concepts of who we thought were squeaky clean and who we thought were very different. And we see that this can kind of change people's views. Yet in this passage, we are reminded that all, even we, will be judged. We will be held to the example just as those who lived in secular cities. And we might ask ourselves, we have our eyes on the city of God. Did the city on a hill that we create, did it look more like an Athens or a Jerusalem? Did we also kind of show the love of Christ? And will we be considered ambassadors for Christ here and now? Because we know that we will be judged, that non-believers will be judged as well, and that the sinful that we perceive as being different in others, they might respond differently than we would, and they might respond better. And so we have to ask ourselves, are we living up to what Christ taught us? But thankfully, with this, we know that our judge is Christ. And we know that Christ sees us as his sheep, that we are stubborn, that we are prone to wander. We will do everything else until we finally have to do the right thing or what Christ commanded us to do in the first place. And we know that we are following somebody that was the only perfect person. And the imperfect people who met him in the flesh were quick to deny, turn him over, and eventually kill him. Today, when we celebrate communion, we celebrate the opportunity that we can live differently today. We celebrate that Jesus is patient with us and that we can be strengthened in our faith because we know that people are watching, not just our neighbors, but we know that Christ in heaven is watching us too, hoping I called you to be here for a purpose and that we make those right decisions. In those times we fall short, we can be lifted up. But we are reminded here in this sacrament that we are not perfect, but that we are loved. And more importantly, we are called to show that love to others, even if we think they live in cities with funny names.